4 years and 100 interviews with entrepreneurial women and men from this region. They worked hard, they're grateful, they give back, and they share the secrets of success with the next generation. Welcome to Season 4 of the Northeast Pennsylvania Business Journal.
Season 4 of the Northeast Business Journal continues. Now, imagine a man who one day decides it's time to get married and have a family, but there are no candidates. He takes an around-the-world trip between jobs and meets his bride in Turkey, where she's a Peace Corps volunteer and leader. Together, they take on the place Fred Waring made famous and built Shawnee on the Delaware. And this is not just a business success story. It's a love story, too.
I'm Charlie Kirkwood, and I live in Shawnee on Delaware, Pennsylvania, where my wife and I own the Shawnee Inn and Country Club.
And that's all I'm going to get out of you?
Well...
You're going to make me work to get this, aren't you?
Well, no, but what would be interesting, I have 5 kids, happily married. They're happily married, I'm happily married, and 15 grandchildren, number 16 on the way. Wonderful.
And Ginny, your lovely wife, you met in the Peace Corps?
Ginny was in the Peace Corps in Turkey running an orphanage, and that's where I met her, and immediately decided I wanted to marry her.
Immediately?
Immediately.
And how long did it take for you to close that deal?
Well, that's a good question. I knew in 20 minutes I wanted to marry her, but it took me 13 months till she agreed.
Persistent, I guess, Ginny, huh?
He was persistent, but we were far apart. I had a year to go in the Peace Corps, so we had a long-range relationship for that year, and we wrote letters back and forth. And then I had said I'd come wherever he was when I got out of the Peace Corps, thinking he meant Pennsylvania, but he meant Bangkok.
Thailand.
Thailand, right.
What a great story. And so how long did you stay in touch by mail, and what years were those?
I can tell you exactly. It was August of '65 when we met, and not only did we stay in touch, I also courted her in a couple of peculiar ways, which were very it happened that a professor of mine from college was teaching at Roberts College, and I had told Ginny I wanted to marry her, and she was considering it. So I got that professor to send her flowers occasionally to remind her of this guy, and I wrote her very frequently.
He did. Roberts College is called the American College of Istanbul. So this guy, I didn't know how these flowers were arriving once a month or so at my orphanage, and lo and behold, it was my romantic husband-to-be following through.
Well, let's set the scene for the audience.
Okay.
We know you from Shawnee on the Delaware. You have interests far beyond that, and a fascinating background. Matter of fact, let me cover a little bit of it to kind of set the scene. You started your relationship with Shawnee on the Delaware as a caddy on the golf course.
That's right. That was I got out of high school in '53, so '52, and I worked in a bunch of resorts in the Poconos, High Point Inn in Mount Pocono, and the Pfeiffer in Bushkill. But I was a caddy for a short time at the Shawnee Inn when I was in high school.
We know the Shawnee Inn, at least I do, historically, and I'm showing my age here, by Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians. How do we associate Fred Waring and the Pennsylvanians with the Shawnee Inn?
Well, Mr. Waring, who was at that time probably the preeminent television personality, used the Shawnee Inn not only as his home base, but he had some shows filmed there. And so it became quite famous and very identified with him. His group was called the Pennsylvanians, and he really put it on the map and personified the Shawnee Inn. We eventually bought it from him, and we got to know him, and his son still works with us at Shawnee.
So Fred Waring's son, and I think you said daughter?
Yeah, he has a daughter who happens to live in the little village of Shawnee on Delaware, which is where Ginny and I live now.
All right, so let's go back before we go forward.
Okay.
You go to Harvard Law School. But let's even go further back. You're raised in the Lehigh Valley. Your father and his father both worked at Bethlehem Steel, which suggests to me that you were raised in a blue-collar environment.
Yes, I was not aware of at the time what a blue-collar environment was, but looking back, yes, my grandfather was the machinist in the Bethlehem Steel Company, and for a short time, my father was also a machinist there, and he got laid off and ended life as a bartender.
So you're not the child of privilege. You don't come from money.
Well, that's true. That doesn't mean that I wasn't privileged.
Oh, well, okay, that's very good.
Yeah.
Good answer. So you go to Harvard Law. So a child of modest means, how does a child of modest means get into Harvard Law School?
Well, I can give you a short answer or a little bit longer. You get into Harvard Law School by having very good academic performance. That's really the major criteria. I happened, and since you referred to it as the blue-collar upbringing, I happened to get into Harvard, Yale, and Williams on the strength a little bit of that so-called blue-collar background. There was a foundation called the Gould Foundation, actually named after Gould of Gouldsville, right here. That man was a Wall Street operator, and he set up a scholarship, which I won. Had nothing to do with my coming from Pennsylvania, but they were looking for blue-collar kids who were strong in academics and decent in athletics and stuff like that. I found that out later after I won the scholarship, but I had gotten, I'm answering your question how I got into Harvard Law School, so I'll go back. I knew that I wanted to go to Harvard Law School from the time I was 11. So it was a little bit direction.
You might need to explain how you knew at age 11.
Okay.
I'll explain.
Okay.
He was a paper boy, and he happened to deliver papers to a law office. And he,
Aaron and Altman was the name of the law office.
And at one point, he happened to ask the principal partner of that law office, how do you turn into a lawyer?
No.
Sorry.
I asked him, how can you afford to buy a new Buick when you don't work? And I'll give you a little bit of color on this. The newspapers cost a nickel a day, which was 35 cents for a week. And if I delivered the papers to Aaron and Altman, was the name of the law firm, and if I got paid by the office manager, I got a nickel. But if I waited till Saturday morning, I got 50 cents instead of 35 cents because the partner there would give me a half a buck for delivering the paper. So we had a little bit of a relationship. One day he showed up in a new Buick, and I said, how does a guy who doesn't work afford a new Buick? He said, what do you mean I don't work? I said, well, you sit at a desk. Because my idea of working was you go to the steel company or you cut down trees or you build houses. And he said, well, that's work. I said, really? And he said, well, I'm a lawyer. I said, well, lawyers go to court. He said, no, some lawyers sit at a desk, talk on the phone, and make money. And that sounded like a pretty good deal to me. So I said, how do you become a lawyer? He told me, and I said, what's the best law school? He said, Harvard Law School.
No kidding.
So at that day, I said, I'm going to Harvard Law School. That was
Did that focus inspire you to better academic performance, or were you always gifted in that way?
Well, I had good marks in school, but I'll tell you what it did do. It informed me of the precise way that you get into law school. By the time I was in high school, I understood about college admissions and stuff, but I happened to be president of the student council in my high school. So I got interviewed by the colleges, and I got a full scholarship to Harvard and Yale and Williams. And I researched that more people were admitted percentage-wise to Harvard Law School from Williams than they are from Harvard. So I chose to go to Williams College and turn down the scholarship from Harvard and Yale, which was the right thing to do. I got into Harvard Law School, which is what my objective was.
Now, you don't know Charlie through any of this, right?
I do not.
All right. Well, let's follow the story further. You graduate from Harvard Law School. Mm-hmm. What decisions are you making about what you want to do and where you want to go?
Well, remember, I had to get an exemption from the draft, so I knew I was going to go in the military in my era.
And what years are these?
I graduated in 1960.
Okay.
So I went to Yorktown, Virginia, Officers Candidate School, and then I got into the Coast Guard, where I served on the cutter Castle Rock out of Boston. I don't know how much detail you want.
You're doing fine. Keep going, Charlie.
All right. Well, that my entire tour was less than a year. 4 months in Officers Candidate School, and then at least 6 months, depending on what you're doing after that. And I mentioned this, by coincidence, our ship, the Castle Rock, was sent to Guantanamo Bay for training at the exact time of the Bay of Pigs invasion, and we got sent out to be a picket ship during that, and we had no idea what was going on. I mean, there was no war declared, no one knew anything, and we got orders.
Did the country know what was going on and you on the ship did not?
Well, in a way, I'll tell you exactly, actually that's a good way of putting it. We went out, I was the cryptographic officer on the ship, so I was supposed to break all these messages, and I couldn't break them. I knew how to do it, and I couldn't. But we were in Guantanamo Bay, and Captain Waters came down and said, "Kirkwood, everybody else is steaming out. What are our orders?" But I realized the date-time group was not encoded, and the date-time group on the message was from Guantanamo Bay, which we were. So I said, "It's coming from over there, Captain." He said, "Go over and find out what it says." So it turned out that the Navy had forgotten to give the Coast Guard the code-breaking signals. But the message that we got was to proceed to such and such a longitude and latitude and interdict traffic to the beach, which is a very unusual order to do. And so we went out and theoretically interdicted passage to the beach during the Bay of Pigs. Guantanamo Bay is a long way away from the Bay of Pigs, but we steamed out, and I had no idea. No one on the ship knew what we were doing. The next 2 days later, we were deployed for 2 days. 2 days later, we came back, and I called my mother in the States, and she told me what was going on.
Incredible. So. Ginny, do many people know the stories we're hearing?
I don't think so. Charlie tells them if asked, but he doesn't talk a lot about his past per se, necessarily. Although we do think that it's interesting. It's kind of unusual and interesting the way we met and eventually married in Thailand.
Amazing. So it's the early 60s, Guantanamo Bay, Bay of Pigs, you're out of college, Coast Guard, and so on. Shortly you'll be going to Vietnam, and I do want to get there in just a moment. But earlier, before we started the interview, I asked you if Shawnee on the Delaware was your first investment, and you said to me you'd been investing since you were a kid.
I should have said I've been working since I was a kid, but I know what you mean. Yeah, I don't exactly know why, but at 8 we had an oxheart cherry tree in our backyard, and I would pick the cherries, put them in the boxes, take my express wagon around our neighborhood and sell cherries. So when I say I've been doing that since I was a kid, that's sort of a business. So.
Okay, work ethic. Our most successful interviewees, time and again, have been people who at a young age, and evidently you were, developed a work ethic.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure whether I would call it a work ethic, but looking back, I now see that I was always figuring things out. I'll give you another example of that. When I was, how old are you? You're 10 in 5th grade, so I was probably about the same, about 8. For Christmas, my parents gave me these rubber molds that you put plaster of Paris in, and you can make things in those molds. I ended up making collie dogs' heads, turkeys at Easter, and seals. That's were the 3 things, and I made them. And my grandmother, we were living at my grandparents, who was a member of the Eastern Stars organization. Yeah. She took them and sold them there for me. So I would go to school, Monocacy School in Bethlehem. I'd come home at noon and make a new batch. Then I'd make batches all evening, and then on the next week.
What age are you?
4th grade. What are you? 8,
9.
8 or 9, yeah.
8 or 9.
Yeah.
You said you figured things out. Has it been your experience and observation that most people at that age and later don't figure things out?
You know, I have never really thought about it that way, but I will. You're using the term blue collar, so I will use that term. Neither of my parents finished high school, so they, I don't know if it weren't motivated or they just didn't think that way. But so whether all people did or not, I never thought about. But in my family, you tried to get a job, and you got a job. But I sort of stepped back a little bit and did it as I described.
Okay. I'm going to come back to this. I want to make sure our audience knows who I'm interviewing here.
Okay.
Charlie Kirkwood and his wife Ginny are the owners of Shawnee on the Delaware and many, many other things. You are both hugely successful business people. So we're going to come back to the beginnings of the story and eventually get to the ends of the story, but it's absolutely fascinating. So we'll go back to the military. When do you complete the military mission?
In the late 61, late 61.
Okay, so we're at the Bay of Pigs. Mm-hmm. What do you do after you're out of the military?
Well, I have interviewed at Harvard Law School, and I am hired by a man named Lee Loomis to work for him on Wall Street. Now, there's sort of, I hadn't thought of it, but it sort of ties into what we talked before. Mr. Loomis was both a very nice guy and a very successful guy, and his family were somewhat famous on Wall Street, and he had inherited the business. His hobby was sailing world-class yachts, and he actually sailed for the America Cup. And when he interviewed at Harvard Law School, he said, I want somebody who doesn't know anything about sailing and will never sail, because he wanted somebody to be in the office, which was one of my qualifications, that I knew nothing about sailing. And it happened that I specialized in tax law, and he also wanted a tax lawyer. So I got hired and went to work at 45 Wall Street when I got out of the service.
And how many years were you there?
I was there for only a year, but Lee owned some properties in Ohio where I went to assist him in selling those properties.
Okay,
Could I interject something,
yes,
please?
Definitely, Ginny.
My husband, the project in Ohio specifically that he went to work upon, this was also before we met, was the merger of a couple of big banks in Athens, Ohio. And the merger was completed, and it was one of the first banks in the United States to ever have be computerized. But the important thing is that after this merger occurred, one of the people who had been a president of one of those banks was in line to become the president of this new, very large bank in Athens, Ohio, except he died. And so Charlie Kirkwood became the youngest bank president in the United States at age 26 and lived then in Athens, Ohio for several years, running a major bank.
May I ask you a direct question? You may blanch a little with this, but is this the beginning of the fortune?
Oh, you know, it's hard to trace.
Let's talk about savings.
I wouldn't say that it particularly was, but I have to correct what Ginny said. She said it was a major bank. It was a major bank in Athens, Ohio. It was a tiny little bank.
Well, it's where Ohio University is, and it was a big bank.
Yeah, in that town it was a big bank.
Your humility's getting in the way, Charlie, of your wife's pride.
Yeah. But
back to my question: is this the beginning of the fortune? You're a child not of money, but when did it dawn on you? When did you realize the importance of saving and having a vision for the future?
Oh, well before that. I mean, I had a whole bunch of other businesses when I was a kid, and when I was at Harvard Law School, I ran the newsstand at Harvard Law School. So I was always doing something. So there was never some time that the light turned on.
It was always on.
Well, I always thought the right thing to do was to try to own something. I mean, that I never thought of it at the time, but that was the distinction that I made. Rather than having to work for somebody, if you can own something, you're better off.
Now, are you saying that you're looking back and seeing that, or did you sense that you knew it very young?
I've never really thought of this before, but it seemed to me like everybody would come to that conclusion as they thought about it. So it wasn't that, when did I think about it? I just think that's the way you think.
So you had several businesses before this period of time in banking. Tell us about some of those beginning small businesses. The molds were one.
Okay. Well, there was the Church League Baseball League in Bethlehem, and every Tuesday and Thursday nights they played baseball not far from where I was. So instead of my going to see the games, I'd ride downtown to Matz's Peanuts and buy 10 pounds of peanuts, put them in the little sacks, and sell them at the baseball game.
And what age are you?
Well, we were about 11, I think, something like that. Yeah. But I mean, in college, you know, I feel a little bit embarrassed talking about these things because some of them seem not particularly noteworthy. But one of the
You'd be surprised how noteworthy this is to the viewers.
Well, one of the requirements of the Gould Scholarship was that the recipient was not to work. They paid absolutely everything. It was the only scholarship that Williams gave that paid your transportation, your room and board, everything, but they required that you not work.
And that was very hard for you, wasn't it?
Impossible. I actually went to the Upper East Side of New York to the foundation in my freshman year at Williams, and I asked them to exempt me from that requirement, which they agreed to do if I forget the wording, but if I kept my grades up. And so in college, I had at least 4 businesses during the time I was.
You weren't working for anybody, they were your businesses.
Well, I waited on tables, so I was working for somebody then. But I set up some little business. I published an address book, and I ran a laundry. There was a student laundry, and the guy who ran it graduated, so I bought that from him, and I ran the laundry.
You're going to college and you buy the business from somebody. Are you saving money through all of this?
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, I did. I finished college. I remember I had an account at the Fidelity Title and Trust, and every Friday when I had my paper route, I started that, and I kept that all the way through college.
Are you beginning, Ginny, to recognize this man, even you haven't met him yet, but are these characteristics true of him in some ways today?
Yes, he works very hard. He's always thinking, and he's very frequently, after 45 years of marriage, he still frequently surprises me with ideas he will have that are either something that does good for the community or something that makes money. And there are lots of such projects around Shawnee all the time.
And I would imagine there are occasions when you have both, things that are good for the community and things that make money, that you marry the two.
That's the perfect combination, of course.
Yeah, there are some. I mean, there's always an element in anything you do. Is it a good thing to do or not? So that's certainly true. But she's the one that does the good deeds in our marriage.
Well, that's how you met, with her doing a good deed.
And
there's so much to tell, and so many ways to go with this story. And as I warned you when we began, this is going to be more than a half hour because we've barely scratched the surface. You two are fascinating people.
Thank you.
All right, so so many different places to go. Shawnee on the Delaware, but we're back in college. You have businesses. You're an investor. When did the sky open up to you in terms of business? Was there a definitive moment?
Well, you know, talking about the sky opening up, I should tell you about the sky falling down.
Yes.
And I tell my kids this story. I don't know how many businesses I have started, but more of them have been unsuccessful than have been successful, which I really emphasize to my kids. I've never gone into any business that I didn't think would be a home run. And at least 60% of them were not home runs, whether they failed or just didn't make any money or weren't successful. Certainly, I have tried more things that have been unsuccessful than I have been successful.
And what is the lesson of that for your kids then?
Yeah, tomorrow's always a better day. I mean, you can't get discouraged about striking out occasionally. But what made me think of that was while I was in law school, I almost didn't get through law school because of a business that I started and failed.
You have to fill in the blanks on that one, Charlie.
You asked about when the sky opened up. Between my first year and my second year, remember, I did not have a full scholarship at Harvard Law School, so I had to work, which I did. When I was at Harvard, I waited on tables and I ran the newsstand, all that other stuff. But between my first year and my second year, I started a business in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I picked it because of the bigger town, and it was putting together a booklet called On the House. And the booklet had 50 tickets in it, and each ticket gave you the right to something else. For instance, I had a barbershop sign up. If you get one haircut that you pay for, you get another hairport.
Sounds like the entertainment book of many years later.
Yeah, probably.
And you created this idea?
Yeah,
You didn't take it from anybody else?
Never heard of it. I figured it out, and I printed the booklets, and I now know what I did wrong, but I didn't know what I did wrong then. I started trying to sell them with ads in the newspaper, and I sold a few, and it was a good idea because you got, let's say in those days, you got $50 worth of value for $2. The book cost $2 or something like that. I couldn't sell them. So I went to the post office, and in those days, I ordered a first-class mailing permit, and I mailed out a very large number. I don't remember how many I mailed out, but they almost all got sent back. And in those days, if somebody returned the mail, you had to pay.
Yeah.
I ended up owing the U.S. Post Office $1,100.
In what years?
That was my second year, so 58. Now, just to give you a comparison, tuition at Williams College when I entered in 54 was $700 a semester, and I owed the U.S. government $1,100. And I didn't have a cent. I hitchhiked up to Cambridge. I went to the dean of admission, Mr. Tepfer, whom I knew well because I worked in his office my first year as a clerk. And I said to him, Dean Tepfer, I don't have a dime, I don't have a place to live.
You didn't have a place to live?
No, and I'm due back tomorrow, classes begin. And I owe $1,100 to the government. He said, how do you owe $1,100 to the government? So I told him the story. He said, wait a second. And he walks into the dean's office, Dean Irwin Griswold of the Harvard Law School. He said, you have to tell the dean this story. So I told the dean that story. And the dean, who's a very reserved guy, was very interested in it. And I don't know what happened, but he said something to Lou Tepfer, and Lou said, all right. Then he took me aside and he said, Harvard has an arrangement with a very prominent widow, and every year she takes in a Harvard student to live at her house. I'm going to have her interview you this afternoon, and if she likes you, you'll have a place to live at least, and we'll worry about the tuition and the other stuff later. And he got me the job running the newsstand at Harvard.
Harvard didn't buy the $1,100 worth of postage for you, did they?
No, but he did give me the newsstand to run, and he also arranged me to wait on table, and he did.
And you eventually paid that off?
Oh, yeah. I mean, in those days, there was no two ways about it. You had to pay it off. But much more significant was Mrs. Prouse. He introduced me to a woman, her name was Martha Peabody Prouse, and she was the matriarch of the Peabody clan, which is a very famous family in Massachusetts. In fact, her nephew was Chub Peabody, who was the governor of Massachusetts. And she lived in a very nice house in Canton, Massachusetts, which is the other side of Boston from Harvard. And she had a 7th, 8 mile horse track there. It was a fabulous setup. And she interviewed me under sort of peculiar circumstances. She had McLeish, a little Scottish terrier, with her during the whole interview. At the end of the interview, I was sort of expecting some indication. She didn't say anything. She said, I will talk to Harvard. Mr. Dean Tepfer called me up and said, Charlie, you got the job. I said, great. Month later, I determined it wasn't her. It was McLeish.
Yeah.
If McLeish liked me, I had the job.
So you had to talk to McLeish.
Yes. And in fact, I lived in the most palatial circumstances you could ever imagine. We had a maid and a butler and a beautiful house, all my meals, everything. I had to take the subway, and I studied in the subway going between Mattapan and Cambridge for 2 years.
Amazing.
His job was to walk McLeish around the
That was the job?
The racetrack every night. That was all he had to do.
All right, it's time to get Ginny involved in this
I'm
interview,
sorry.
Charlie.
No,
Well,
it's
actually,
all
I
right.
would like you to tell us about Ginny and what role she has played in the people you are today.
Oh, well, the predominant role. As I said, I knew I wanted to marry Ginny as soon as 20 minutes after I met her. And for two reasons, or I shouldn't say reasons. I mean, that type of decision is very emotional. You don't calculate it, but I was immediately captivated by a couple of things. She didn't smoke, which is an obsession of mine. I really can't stand smoking, so that was really a big deal for me. She didn't give a damn about money, which was really, and still doesn't, which was a big deal to me, and she loved kids.
Contrary to you, because you did give a damn about money.
You know, I want to be careful how I answer that. I care a lot about being able to do things. And in our society, to do things,
You have to have
you
money.
frequently have to have money.
Yes, of
So
course.
that's more of a connection to me. I tell my kids all the time, it's immoral just to get rich to have an easy life. If you're going to work hard and make money, you do it because you want to do other things. You want to do something with it. So I didn't mean to correct you with that.
No, I'm glad you did. That's very important.
But to come back to Ginny, Ginny has an extraordinary background as well of her family taking in people and being very involved in what we would call the social issues of the day. And that was very appealing to me. And Ginny has, throughout our marriage, in addition to being a fabulous mother, as you know, we have 5 children, has had her own career. I don't know if you know this, but she was the head of Special Olympics for the state of Pennsylvania, 30,000 Special Olympians. She is still on the board of World Education, which is a Boston-based charity that gives away $100 million a year in education. She goes to Asia frequently as the director to be sure that that's done properly, and she's been involved in a whole bunch of causes like
I want to
that.
get Ginny talking. You're talking about
Sorry.
her, but that's okay. Let me ask you a political question, if I may. Are you conservative Republican?
I am a Republican. I would say I'm conservative on the economic issues.
All right, so your attraction to Ginny, and you said one of the things that interested you was that her parents were very active in social matters and social causes. Some today would call that a liberal point of view.
No question. Her parents were definitely liberal, and Ginny would tell you that she's a liberal, which isn't completely correct, but she's more, in that scale, much more liberal than I am.
So your politics are still different.
I would say yes.
I
But
would-
they have, I mean, I used to be sort of a radical, and he was a Republican. And he kind of pulled me, especially at the local level. I think I would say I'm rather conservative. We don't often differ, you know, dramatically, but if on a perfect scale, I would definitely be to the left of Charlie typically on many issues.
It wasn't too hard to be to the left of Charlie, was it?
Well, we've come around to, we respect each other's viewpoints, and by and large, I think that we have a lot of compatibility on many issues.
And it's very hard. Liberal versus conservative really mask values. I mean, you can have very, very similar values, which I say Ginny and I do,
Yes.
and be classified as liberal or conservative, which mask the agreement on the values.
How many years are you married?
45 years this year.
45 years this year. Tell us about you. Where did you go to school, and how did you get to the Peace Corps?
I went to college. I grew up in Detroit and went to Ohio Wesleyan University. And I spent my junior year in Mexico at Mexico City College and the University of Mexico. So I sort of got a quick open eye to a slightly broader picture. Plus, as Charlie mentioned, my parents very often took in foreign students who were studying at Wayne State University, where my father was a professor. But again, my family was not also a wealthy family. My father got his PhD when I was 7, and then my mother went to college at age 40, and they struggled along. And part of the reason they took in students was because it was helped financially. But it did open our eyes, my 2 sisters and I, to sort of broader world. And my parents though they had not ever had a chance to travel, definitely had a broad spectrum to their life. Eventually, I joined the Peace Corps because of Kennedy and his speech about
his inauguration speech.
Yes, about ask not what you can,
Yes,
your
of
country
course.
can do for you, what you can do for your country, and it spoke directly to me, especially having just returned from a year in Mexico where I saw a good bit of poverty and the need for the importance of trying to help other people. And at that time, we all thought we could save the world, and we were all interested in Bobby Dylan and the times they are changing and all of those sort of thing. And I thought I was a small version of Joan Baez and I could go and help save the world. And I was very surprised when I was invited to go to Turkey because I already spoke some Spanish and was really interested in Latin America. However, Turkey turned out to be a wonderful place for me. I lived for 1 year in a very small town where I worked in a provincial orphanage, and the second year in a slum in Istanbul. And the reason I'm very happy I went to Turkey is because I met Charlie as he was passing through Istanbul on his trip around the world, following his years as a banker. When he tells me he was looking for a wife, but he was also learning about the world itself.
Let's time out. I got to hear more about a couple of things that you
Sure.
mentioned. We're going to come back to you.
Fine.
You took a time out. You essentially said, I took a year off. You traveled the world. You told your friends you were looking for a wife. You better tell us about that.
Well, it's not quite that cynical. I was 30. I wasn't married. I knew I wanted to get married. I knew I wanted to have kids, and I was taking at least a year off, to, as I like to say, to see if the world was round. And I met women on that trip, and it was actually through another woman that I got introduced to Ginny, and that was, of course, the beginning of our romance and our marriage. But remember, this is the height of the Vietnam
Yes,
controversy at that time. And a lot of people in this country were trying to figure out what's going on. And I was involved in a conversation, I don't know, a dialogue with a professor at Ohio University about what was really happening in Vietnam. And one of the things that I wanted to find out was what was happening in Vietnam. And on my trip around the world, I hitchhiked into Saigon. So
During the Vietnam War?
During the Vietnam War.
What year?
We got married in the end of 66, 65. 65. Yeah. And I bummed around, I hitchhiked around Vietnam during the war on planes and stuff. So I was, and
Amazing.
I was there really, and I mean, you were probably aware of it, but this was an intense issue in my generation.
Pitted generation against generation in our country, without
Yes,
question.
sure.
Yeah, and you couldn't be liberal or conservative or involved or uninvolved. I mean, it was really the first time when we were involved in a cause which involved every aspect of your life, whether it was business or whether you were going to go to college or go in the military. I mean, people were fleeing to Canada because they didn't want to go in the military. So it was a really an intense intellectual
Tumultuous time in our country.
tumultuous time.
Absolutely. So what did you discover? You hitchhiked around Vietnam. What conclusion did you draw?
We still have interest in Vietnam today.
But that's not the question.
Right.
The question is, what did Charlie Kirkwood conclude about the Vietnam War because you hitchhiked around?
All right. I think the activity of the Americans there assisted in opening up some of the fantastic things that are happening in Asia now. That's a complicated story. But had we not gone into Vietnam, I think it's very likely that Asia would be significantly different today than it is. I can draw a line, but it would take me more than a half hour, between what we did and the economic development, particularly in Taiwan, Korea, Singapore, those tigers.
And also Thailand.
And Thailand. I can draw a line between them and what's happening in China today, and I would say, had we not gone into Vietnam, that would not be true.
All right, well, let me ask you a really tough question.
Go ahead.
Was what you've described as the benefit worth 50,000 American lives?
No one can put a value on a life, so I can't give you a dollar and cents kind of answer, but I'll say this. We lost 57,000 people killed in Vietnam, and we kill 38,000 people a year on our roads in this country, in automobile accidents. So if I were to say on the grander scale, are more people much better off in every way? Freedom, economic development, education, health. Are more people better off because of what we did in Vietnam? The answer is unquestionably yes.
Have you had this conversation?
No, not really.
Because you're telling me about the times they are a changin', Joan Baez. I can relate to all of that. And the spirit behind all of those protest lyrics and melodies, and they're not consistent with what your husband's saying.
I can't comment on his viewpoint, though I would definitely concur that the presence of the Americans in Asia dramatically changed a lot of things about many of the peripheral countries, I think, for the better. In terms of Vietnam itself, it's very interesting. I was in Vietnam 2 months ago, and the people over there love Americans, were incredibly nice to me, and it was hard for me to also to bridge the fact that we had a small home and apartment in Vietnam, in Saigon, in the late 60s, and you know, during the war, that would have seemed inconceivable to me that this could be possible. But it is possible, and it is happening. And I don't know for sure, but I think that the fact that there were a lot of Vietnamese who had a lot of relationships with Americans that have perhaps lent to this, you know, prosperity that is occurring all over Southeast Asia now, in both the business climate and the political climate and every other way.
And the outlook. I mean, I can give you a very precise example of one of the things that I learned when I was in Vietnam in '65. Excuse me. Yeah, it's 65. I bummed around, usually with the military. I created an ID card. I created a newspaper, and I said I was a reporter on that newspaper. I wasn't.
So you were a credentialed reporter.
I got credentialed in Vietnam, and I had an interpreter, and I would interview ordinary people. I remember one in Pleiku, some woman, and it was like I dropped in from the moon. I mean, what's this guy there? And I just asked her, how bad were things? Oh, they were terrible, and those Viet Cong won't let us do this or do that. And they just felt, they didn't have much view about the American, but they just thought the situation there was so repressive and so bad that they wanted it changed. Now, you didn't get that from the press, but I was talking to a woman in Pleiku who had no idea who I was, and when I asked her that question, that's what she said.
Okay, we're in the 60s.
Right.
It's time to get to 2011.
I'm sorry.
No,
it's
nothing
true.
to be sorry about.
I want to make sure that I don't think we want to be apologists for what happened to Vietnam. I think both of us feel bad about the time and the wrenching in this culture, in our home culture, because of that situation is significant and changed America forever, which I think we both regret. Yeah. And we were living overseas for many years thereafter. So it's not, you know, we're not experts on what was happening here, but we know, of course, know about it.
Ginny,
and I just don't want to be on the air saying that I think the war in Vietnam was a wonderful thing and that it has now made caused wonderful progress.
You're raising my audience's sophistication, intelligence by your points of view, and that's very important and very much appreciated. Did you, one more 60s question, did the Peace Corps change your life in any way other than meeting your husband?
Hugely. I think this is true of all 200,000 people who have served in the Peace Corps. For almost any Peace Corps volunteer, that experience becomes a defining experience in your life, because not only are you living full-time in a foreign country, speaking a foreign language, and finding yourself fully immersed in a very different world, that doesn't go away when you leave. And so you bring that home with you, and that is a prism through which you look at a lot of other things for the rest of your life. I had the intense privilege of 18 years later going back to be the director of the Peace Corps in Thailand, for which I'm not mentioning that for kudos. I'm mentioning it because it was an experience that went on throughout my life, that interest in foreign cultures, the globalization of the whole world, and the chance to look at things not just as an American, but as an American who has had a chance to be in several foreign cultures at length, and then see things through the eyes of those people.
And not as a tourist. When you're there as a Peace Corps volunteer, you're on the ground walking the walk. And Ginny walked the walk.
I talked to my mother once the first year I was in Turkey,
goodness.
and I was living in a small village.
You know, this is such a good connection, though, to right here. Last week, Ginny and I entertained 28 Turkish law students who are at Marywood. This is an incredible story, Bill. We're having supper in a restaurant in Strasbourg, the Istanbul restaurant, and there are all these young people speaking Turkish. Ginny stands up, starts to speak to them in Turkish, and they can't believe here's this woman
lose the language.
who knew the language.
I did not.
And we then invited them to Shawnee last Tuesday, and they came, and we just had a wonderful time with them. So the connection of, did the Peace Corps change her life? I mean, right here, how many times you're going to have, and these very impressive kids, 1 million people took the exam, the high school finishing exam, and these 28 kids were all in the top 100.
Wow.
And Turkey is a country of 70 million. It's a huge country.
They mentioned to us, for example, when they came to Shawnee for dinner last Tuesday night, we have a concert on our lawn every Tuesday night. So we invited them for the dinner, followed by the free concert. And they said that we were the only Americans that they'd really had a chance to speak to because they can't speak English. And we were certainly the only people that were able to entertain them during their 2 or 3 week tour of the United States. And so that makes me feel great. I don't say my Turkish is perfect, but it was so deeply...
Ginny was able to talk to them, and we've gotten a bunch of email from, but there, I tried to tie in where we are now, her Peace Corps experience.
And my Peace Corps experience was 45 years ago.
And it's as fresh as ever.
Yeah. We also had lived in Thailand for many years, where I had the fun of having a second very intense Peace Corps experience.
Well, she ran the Peace Corps there.
But, you know, that's the sort of thing I meant, about seeing things through different eyes.
We have 10 minutes left, and it's been an hour interview,
Oh
not a half hour. So we have to leap ahead to 2011.
Okay.
And I'm going to ask you, Charlie, if you will, and Ginny, to look back on the years. Did you ever imagine that you would be, individually or maritally, the people you are today? Or is life an ongoing evolution that changes you and you grow with it?
Why don't you be first?
I never thought of it in those terms, but I have frequently thought about what it is that allows you to succeed when you undertake something. Remember, I said I failed a lot of times. So I don't know if that's responsive to your question, but what I have learned is what I knew when I was a kid and I saw all the time, and that is get down and study the details and really understand something. Don't skate on the surface. And the guys who were successful and the women who were successful were people who really understood things. Remember I said I understood, who understood things and worked hard to understand those things and didn't try and talk the talk, but walk the walk, to put it in modern terms.
I'll talk about the journey of life that brings you where you are. I had no possible imagination to lead me to the place we are now. I grew up in a small rented house in Detroit. But I think what I would like to mention is our family, if I may.
Of course.
We have 5 children. 3 of our kids were born in Thailand. One of our sons and his wife recently returned to Shawnee after living for 18 years in China, 12 years married, and he was there before that. And all of those kids and our son and his wife speak Chinese. Our next son majored in Japanese in school. The first one majored in Chinese in university. He has been in Japan for the last 8 years, recently has left, mostly because, or at least push a little bit because of the earthquake and other difficulties there. He and his family are moving to a place near Singapore to continue their work in Asia. Everybody comes home to Shawnee for summers and Christmas. The third son, who is an environmental lawyer, lives in Shawnee with his wife and children, but he also lived in Thailand and has worked very hard in the tsunami relief there, spent 8 months working when the tsunami hit Thailand, and goes back and forth very often and has a strong and abiding interest in Thailand and his work there. Our fourth son, Jonathan, is leaving for Beijing with his wife and 3 children. In August, they have just spent 3 years in Japan. So, I mean, our kids are very Asian-oriented.
Don't leave out Amy.
And our daughter Amy does public health work, living in Thailand now with her husband, who also does public health work. They have one child and another one on the way. But I want to emphasize that for all 5 of our kids who have all lived and worked in Asia and have all been successful entrepreneurially there, and also have all had strong altruistic involvements, which have been part of our family since the very beginning, have had a very global view of life. And I think that is because of the life that we led, though he came from a small rented house in Bethlehem and I came from a small rented house in Detroit. But my point is that they all come home. Pennsylvania's home, and every one of them knows it. 4 of the 5 have houses in Shawnee, and the other one is going to build in Shawnee, and they all plan to come back here to live eventually because of the quality of life in northeastern Pennsylvania, and because this has been where they were raised and where they have their roots.
Where they're from.
They come home for Christmas and they come home for the summers.
Jenny, you have managed in the last probably 2 minutes of your comment to put it all together for the interview.
So what I want to say is family is everything. That's it. I had to interrupt for that much.
But that's wonderful.
I'm
Charlie, Ginny mentioned 2 words that absolutely ring true for the series: entrepreneurship and altruism. And evidently, all 5 of your kids have picked up the model. Did they pick it up from you? And I know you're a modest person, but we as parents do model for our children.
Well, yeah.
Entrepreneurship, which is still moving through your blood, and altruism.
I'm going to say they picked it up. They probably picked it up by example, but that leads to something much more profound, I think, with regard to our kids. We have been able, and we love our kids and get along very well with our kids, but we weren't always the forgiving, nice parent. Ginny is much more nurturing than that, but if our children didn't do well on a test, I didn't say, oh, it's great you tried. Or if they struck out, I didn't say, oh, you really made a good swing. I said, you should have got a hit. And that's, so there's a, I don't know if I'm being responsive to
that's
your
a great
question,
answer.
But if they got an example, it was something that we practice in our lives and that we do. Remember I said, you learn the details, you understand what you're doing. You don't skate on this, or you don't, talk the talk.
Why am I thinking of Joe Kennedy? I mean, the Kennedy kids were raised by a tough and demanding father. Were you tough and demanding in your own opinion?
Well, I have to say this. I didn't think it was my role, excuse me, to make my kids like me. I was much more focused on whether, excuse me, whether they would be proud of themselves, feel good about themselves, be competent, be successful, than whether they thought I was their buddy. And I'm really delighted to say that I feel I have a very good relationship with my kids now, but I wasn't always there to say, nice try.
Any regrets?
With regard to the kids?
Family?
We should have had more kids, I guess. But other than that, I don't have, with regard to my family, I don't have any regret. They're all happily married to wonderful people with wonderful kids. They got very unusual and different educations, but they all are. When we have a conversation, they have important things to say. I just absolutely love it that they have their views. And
would they have turned out to be the remarkable kids, grown-up kids, they are today all over Asia and our world, had you not been the kind of father you are?
Well, you have to be married to a woman like Ginny to be, I mean, I'm guessing, to be successful that way, because Ginny is extraordinarily nurturing, and we did interesting things with our kids. So I almost said it takes a family. It does take a family. I mean, to have kids, in my view, you really need to have both sides of it. They always knew that Ginny was there to banish them when they skinned their knee, and they always knew that if they didn't do it right, I'd tell them. So I guess that works.
Can I say a couple, since this is nearing the end of the interview, I'd like to say a couple words about, first of all, we have a number of businesses in Asia, as you've probably ascertained, and also a couple of businesses elsewhere in Pennsylvania. So Shawnee was really a place to raise our family, more than a place to make money or to have our business interests be centered. But nevertheless, I want to brag briefly about what Charlie has accomplished at Shawnee. The resort is in fantastic shape, and we now have an organic farm where we grow all of our own produce. We raise our own honey. We do our own maple syrup. We brew our own beer. We have a wonderful brewery there started by our son Peter called Shawnee Craft Brewery. And a lot of things like that are going on. And if I might brag just further, the general manager of Shawnee Inn, Rob Howell, last week in Atlanta, Georgia, was named the best general manager in the whole United States by the Association of Hotel and Hospitality and Resort Convention, blah, blah, whatever it's really called. So we're very, very proud of both Rob and the fact that our hotel is in a position where it could be nominated for such a wonderful honor. But that a great deal of that is due to Charlie's perseverance to make Shawnee a much better place than it ever had been under the former owners, and both of whom went bankrupt essentially. Yeah. And we make it a place that's really nice for normal people to come. We provide meals for the hungry throughout the winter. We have lots of free concerts and other cultural events at Shawnee. So if I could just advertise Shawnee just that much.
Good for you. And unfortunately, you have 20 seconds to answer this question. Okay. Where does it go from here? Your kids are not going to inherit or take over, one would assume, Shawnee, because they have lives of their own all over our world. Where do we go from here?
Well, I don't agree with that. I think our kids will own Shawnee and use it as we viewed it, as a wonderful place and a base. And I think they will do things not just in business. They will do things which are good for the community and they feel fulfilled about. And I think they'll always be in Shawnee.
It's a great place to live.
So you have a plan and a vision for the future.
So do they. And it involves running Shawnee, I think, and doing other things. You know, Shawnee will be their base, as it was for us. Yeah.
Wonderful story. Great interview. You two are fascinating people. Thank you so much for coming here today.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, you dug deep with some of these things, so we appreciate it.
Next week, meet the Northeast Pennsylvania man who learned the hospice business in Florida and Illinois and then brought it back to Northeast Pennsylvania. For nearly 30 years, Phil Decker dedicated his life to helping people at the end of their lives. A lot of people don't understand hospice, and those who work in it, as you'll see, are special people. And next week, we'll also introduce you to Douglas Fink, third-generation president and CEO of Pennsylvania Paper and Supply Company. Learn how it all started in 1922 with his then 23-year-old grandfather.